Hey guys, as you all know, Currency Wars has overhauled every single one of the game's characters, well, except for a select few, and either added or reworked parts of their kits for a completely new reimagining of the character. Today I'll be going through every single Currency Wars character kit, their changes compared to their non-Currency Wars versions, and rate how much I would like these changes if they were implemented as Nova Flare buffs. That being said, Currency Wars isn't one-to-one with Star Rail's current combat system, so I'll address game mode specific interaction differences whenever they come up, like off-field effects and whatnot, and how I might see them translating that into their regular combat system. I also won't focus as much on raw damage increases over new mechanic additions, since it's more interesting to talk about how those extra mechanics can affect the character's viability. Simply bigger numbers just translate one-to-one to better performance, not really worth breaking down on its own. Just for fun, I'll be ranking them in a Prydwen-esque fashion, with the absolute best changes being Tier 0, changes that would breathe a new meta or fun playstyle into the character being Tier 1 to Tier 2, and niche changes that might only occasionally matter in Tier 3 and 4. With that, let's get straight into the meat and potatoes. For the purposes of this video, I'll be sorting characters by school bond, seeing as it fits better with their gameplay role than, say, their faction bond or cost level. Although you will tend to notice that higher cost characters will generally have better buffs. But starting off, we have the Quantum Resonance School, and first up is the one and only Miss Sparkle. Sparkle's reworks are limited to her off-field version, where she trades the ability to use her skill and advanced DPS by 50% for passive energy regen for every on-field ally attack and SP consumed. In exchange, however, her crit damage buff becomes AoE, a privilege normally reserved for her E6, though it lacks the same additional power boost that comes with it. It also actually lasts 2 turns instead of the usual 1.999, and both gain scaling on Quantum Resonance stacks, aka the number of Quantum characters in the team, and doubles in potency for Quantum Resonance members, those members being Seele, Silverwolf, and Xuan. Obviously, it would be hard to translate all of these changes to endgame exactly as is, so assuming that Sparkle still retains access to her advancing skill, but gains the passive energy regen and the AoE crit damage rework, something it could do with this upcoming Nova Flare as well, with the buff doubling in potency for all Quantum characters, perhaps even, I think it would really build upon her identity as not just an SP printer, but a unique action advance support with entirely AoE buffs. Tier 2 overall, nothing too crazy, but still furthers her advantage in her best scenarios, helps her buff uptimes, and opens up a real incentive for Mono Quantum beyond a measly 30% attack boost. Oh, and I know the talent raising her off-field SP cap by 2 is just so that she still provides the same +2 SP cap as she does on-field, but as an archer main, it would really be nice to just have her raise the SP cap by like a little bit more. 9 SP just feels like too low of a cap when this man can use up to 8 to 10 in a single turn. For Seele, they just made her skill and ult about 1.5 times stronger and gave her a new execute mechanic where she insta-kills enemies below a certain percent of their max HP, scaling with the number of Quantum Resonance stacks on the team. I know I said I wouldn't focus on raw multiplier increases, but when you make that like a separate new talent, there is something to be said about how blatantly that acknowledges, yeah, her numbers are just too low. While the changes don't seem that dramatic on paper, being able to proc Resurgence more often lets Seele absolutely go to town, and the max HP threshold even guarantees she won't get her kill stolen by, say, Robin or Tribby. Of course, she still does rely on her numbers keeping up with HP inflation to stay relevant, so with the only thing in her kit being improved being her raw damage, it would only be a matter of time before enemy bloat outpaces her current supports, and her damage snowball once again completely melts. Still though, definitely deserving of at least a tier 2 change, as the max HP% mechanic would make her at least slightly more resistant, and it opens some interesting team building possibilities if that execute threshold really is based on the amount of Quantum team members you have. As for Silverwolf, well, after the buffs made her ult AoE, they decided to finally follow suit here and make her skill AoE as well. Oh, and it deals comparable damage to her ult now too, which is pretty appropriate given off-field Wolf doesn't have an ultimate. They added stacking vulnerability to her bugs, which, you guessed it, also grows in power with more Quantum Resonance stacks. AoE implants are obviously really strong, and spammable AoE implants with the potential for 1 to 2 turn ults with tutorial are even stronger. I mean, just look at how fast a Naxa breaks stuff. Pretty broken for Himeko, Rappa, and DPS Wolf if this were to be implemented, looking at you, E2 Dahlia, Very cool punctuality and synergy for our imaginary DPS as well, but otherwise not as impactful as you'd think, since each implant still does cost 1 SP, and for single target content, her implant transfers after defeating enemies anyways. Tier 3 at minimum though. Bridging the quantum resonance and heal bonds is Xuan, and man does she really need more help with the latter. With casters and her squad raising the thresholds for AoE damage, it can be pretty uncomfortable sustaining with her due to either her own ult charges running out, not having enough ults to keep the team topped up with her puny heals, or doing both but at a massive SP deficit thanks to the massive energy difference between her skill and basic. In Currency Wars, she not only gains more damage reduction and offensive buffs for better sustain and strength alike, but her stacks now heal the entire team based on their missing HP, not just herself. This means that she and her team have become basically immortal while she has charges, which is very creatively renamed here as Flip for some reason. However, if you want to use her this way, she needs to be off-field, which really sucks since gaining Flip is locked behind 3 to 5 enemy kills per stack. And well, she can't ult while she's off-field since she has no way to gain energy. Assuming this isn't a problem in regular endgame though, and she can still regen her ult normally, the AoE heals and extra damage buffs, which yes grow in potency with more quantum characters too, would do a lot to make her a lot more comfortable sustain, and put her close to back on top as the ultimate preventer of one-shots. Tier 2. Also, seeing the entire team join her in her flip animation is really cool, and I'm in favor of her talent rework just for that animation change alone. And now, for someone who really should have been a healer from the start due to his competition with Trend Sustains, Jiaoqiu. Kit-wise, Jiaoqiu only gets one change in an additional talent, but man, it is an absolutely amazing one that ties his whole kit together. Every time an ally attacks or inflicts a debuff, Jiaoqiu heals the ally with the lowest HP. These two effects stack by the way, so most debuffs, which are applied via attacks, provide double the healing. Perfect for Dot and Acheron, two very debuff attack heavy teams who could definitely use a dedicated sustain. And especially in Acheron's case, she doesn't gain a stack from Jiaoqiu unless enemies take an uninterrupted turn, which really begs the question why Jiaoqiu never provided healing to offset his encouraged playstyle of letting enemies wail on you to begin with. Not just that though, but his healing scales off of his attack, further rewarding you for meeting his insane EHR thresholds thanks to up to 140% of it being self-converted into more attack. And don't forget the extra 100% attack that Kafka gives him either. Overall, despite being such a small change on paper, it works so darn well with his kit and his niches that I feel wrong giving it anything less than tier 1. It still sucks that he still has his cap of 6 Ashen Rose procs per ult though. Not that it matters much in endgame, but for Currency Wars it matters a lot. And in pure fiction, well, it'd let him run his S1 a lot more comfortably over an energy regen cone like Solitary or Tutorial, that's for sure. With Gallagher's baseline making him already a great sustain as he is, especially by 4-star standards, they really just made his enhanced basic and besotted healing permanently up, boosted his healing just a bit based on his max HP, made his vulnerability generic instead of break locked, and called it a day. Like, yeah, that's high key all he needs. Tier 1, pretty solid improvement, especially since it means more energy, attack reduction, debuffs, toughness damage, and healing on a basic spam rotation. Honestly, the only real change Huohuo received was receiving extra energy per ally turn when off-field to make up for the fact that she can't basic her skill anymore. Sure, the healing per ally turn or ult resets on her ult and not her skill now, which could make for an interesting basic spam rotation if both changes to her kit were just imported as is, but given how lackluster her healing usually is, it probably won't change too much for her. Tier 3, though, I can definitely see this being abused on certain energy-hungry teams, with gold hair DPS that spam turns. Yada yada, if I had a nickel for every team that I'm describing, I'd have 2 nickels, you know the drill. Hyacine really, didn't get that much of a change, I won't lie. Sure, she gains extra damage scaling from ally heals now, and little Ika does 20% more damage. Whippy. But realistically, outside of SU, DU, and Currency Wars, how often are you going to run multiple healers on a Hyacine team? That's right, I didn't think so. Tier 4, and that's being generous. Not like she needed much buffs though anyways. I guess it helps wacky teams like Vladi's Tonkai sustain rail at least. You know, ignoring the part where her heals aren't nearly enough for what Currency Wars asks of the player and her buffs are lacking for a 3-star unit, Natasha's rework is actually quite nice. Not only does she provide a ramping damage percent buff per ult that stacks up to 5 times and lasts 3 turns, but her continuous healing is now per action instead of per turn, both in her ult and in her E too. Don't forget that her ult is only 100 energy, making it deceptively spammable, especially with her S1. Combine that with her E4 providing her 5 energy if anyone gets hit, not just herself, and her E6 increasing the damage buff she provides by 50%. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Natasha actually feels like a stronger character with Eidolons now. Don't get me wrong, a general lack of cleanse outside of her single target skills still sucks, but Natasha's new kit, if it were imported to the game as it is today, would make her not just usable in today's meta, but possibly even comfortable, so long as there aren't oppressive amounts of CC and debuffs. Tier 2 just for giving her an actually respectable AoE damage boost and making her Eidolons do something. Finally, for the healers comes the original Mr. Numbers man himself, Luocha. His talent field finally comes with vulnerability on base, and what little downtime it had is now gone as it's now truly permanent. Rather than one emergency skill heal with a cooldown of 2 turns, Luocha automatically gets 1 emergency heal stored up for each one of his turns, being able to hold up to 4 at a time. The vulnerability really helps further his position as a jack-of-all-trades healer, and the increased healing is never a bad thing, especially on casterist teams who need a non-Hyacine budget option, scarce as those are today. Oh, and Mighty especially appreciates it too. Tier 2 as well, just enough to make him actually work with the 1 or 2 characters that want more than his already obscene amounts of healing. Now, onto the shielders. March 7th just gains the blast effect to her shield, where it also shields at half the original power for adjacent allies, and provides the same taunt if they're also above 30% HP. Tier 4, as well, better shielders still do exist, though I'm sure for all you 7 people out there still running March Sustain, this is excellent news as you won't need to switch shielding targets nearly as often. Did someone say more gambling? Now every time Aventurine shields his allies, he rolls a number from 1 to 6 per ally and provides bonus shielding proportional to the number rolled. Plus if he hit a 6, that's an extra blind bet stack. Feeling lucky? The payout reward for hitting it big also increases as well. Aventurine shields now cap out at double what they used to, and based on how much shield you have, Aventurine's follow-ups and ults do even more damage, meaning that you really just want to go all in on defense now. Which is really nice given how sub-DPS Aventurine builds seem to just struggle sustaining these days. That being said, it's about a tier 2 change, I think, since it honestly doesn't change his best matchups all too much, and the slight added comfortability, while super nice, can feel more like a bonus than a necessity sometimes, especially when you consider that the only damage being buffed from this rework is his own, and not his allies. Okay, look, it's not like Dan needs buffs. That being said, they just increased his Soul Dragon speed from 160 to 220, which, if you're backlining him, still feels hecka slow. Honestly, given how Bondmate attacks advance the Soul Dragon anyways, which actually advance by smaller AV amounts with higher and higher speed, it doesn't feel ridiculous to say that this would be a pretty underwhelming change. Tier 4, the speed increase is nice, but bro is basically the same as he is outside of currency wars without accounting for star levels, bonds, and equipments, minus the extra speed. And landing on the shielders, hoo boy, Gepard. Now there's a rework I can get behind, literally. He ain't the wall of Bellabog for nothing. Attack increase to all allies above a certain amount of shield? Yes please. A defense and shield scaling AoE counter every 4 enemy attacks that provides a basic's worth of extra energy? Say less. And automatic shielding at the start of every wave and boss phase? Whoa, Nelly, we have an actual sustain on our hands. They really make Jeppy feel super beefy between his ult and his ground pound attacks, animation-wise at least, so finally seeing and experiencing both on the ally side just provides me with a classic hit of dopamine, reminiscent of his 1.0 days. Tier 1 easily. Now, onto the breakers. Rappa gets by far the smallest rework, maybe due to being a 1-star, maybe just because Huohuo doesn't care enough about her. But in either case, at least it's a decent enough power boost. 10 extra Omni Toughness in the form of 2 bounce hits per enemy break is nice, and while in low target scenarios, the additional break damage scaling likely won't do much since, well, imaginary break sucks. It could be useful for setting off break chain reactions in multi-enemy scenarios like Pure Fiction, which is especially great since Rappa is more of a blast AoE hybrid than a true AoE DPS, causing her to often not break enemies all at once, something that this talent should hopefully fix. I'll conservatively say tier 3, definitely strongest inside of Pure Fiction, though honestly I'm not sure it's enough even then to help her off-element performance, given the random nature of bounce attacks and again imaginary breaks low scaling. The only real change that Ruan Mei receives is that her ult now receives permanent uptime. With that said, if you ask any break player nowadays how impactful this change is, you might be surprised at just how appreciated it is to not have to play around her ult uptime. Appreciation, however, does not necessarily translate to power, and while this makes her much easier and way less frustrating to play, especially pre-E6, it's not a big enough impact to make her particularly strong even in her dedicated archetype. Someone feel free to let me know if I'm wrong though. Tier 3 for now. Okay, we all know that Himeko can now store unlimited charges for truly insane follow-up potential in multi-way scenarios in Currency Wars, but did anyone also realize that those follow-ups apply a small amount of vulnerability now? Oh, and also she gets the extra 100 to 250% break effect in her base kit, and also another 100% plus a 20% multiplier to her follow-up damage at E6, and that her skill ignores weakness types when dealing toughness damage. Yeah, they really seem to be leaning towards the break Himeko route, and I for one am happy to see it. Still though, I'd say that these buffs are tier 1 and not quite tier 0, just because for now at least, Himeko is still pretty dependent on Firebeat content, as well as Fugue and Dahlia nowadays, to get the job done in Pure Fiction. Speaking of Fugue, wow, they really just made her 50% toughness reduction and her E1's 50% weakness break efficiency apply to the whole team. And 5 extra energy per 10 toughness reduced, so now even the increased exo toughness scaling from 40 to 50% of original toughness feels like a buff instead of a nerf compared to what we got in MOC. And her ult applies 25% vuln for 2 turns, making it do something useful now. See, Huohuo? Wasn't so hard, huh? Tier 1 easily, maybe even tier 0. Look at what happened to Silverwolf when they gave her more energy and made her single target amp AoE. Lingsha's rework was pretty funny. She's not even classified as a healer in Currency Wars. Now her skill and ult spawn 1 and 2 extra respective bunnies. 3 Fuyuans on the field is really funny, especially when each one now inflicts stacking vulnerability, and the ability to spawn multiple Fuyuans instead of just refreshing Fuyuan's available actions make her feel properly rewarding to play on a skill spam heavy playstyle. Sure, she runs a higher risk of stealing the kills from your break DPS, but with triple the summons you could just, make her the main DPS instead. Tier 2, a bit unwieldy as a generalist, but well worth the change if properly managed, or if just running her has a hit count battery, or main DPS. Also, think about Sunday moving up 4 units at once. Now, isn't that a nice thought? And as for the Cowboy, tier 1 minimum. They doubled his toughness reduction and made that double toughness reduction in the form of 2 extra bounces. He starts battle with 1 extra pocket trick shot, as if his E1 wasn't his base kit, but of course his E1 stacks too. His ult deals an extra 20 toughness, going from 30 to 50 on base, and his break damage scaling has improved slightly, though annoyingly it still has that 160 toughness calculation cap. Interestingly, this makes Boothill a far more competent super break DPS, something that should be especially apparent if you played him with the Dahlia and MOC even before these changes, since his break and break talent damage can only trigger once per toughness bar and attack respectively, while no such cap exists for what essentially becomes double or more super break damage. And now let's address the potential other Nova Flare in the room. They deadass gave Firefly a whole new ultimate with AoE toughness damage and res down, slap on fixed energy to her basic and ult to make it actually reasonably attainable, increase her super break scalings, and let her stay in complete combustion state practically forever. Oh, right, and she can now deal super break damage versus non-broken enemies. The Dahlia foreshadowing is not subtle. Kind of funny how most of her changes are literally just given to her in this new character that we have now, but yeah, this is like almost everything Firefly could have asked for buffs-wise. She does still need a new support to boost her power, as does every other break DPS right now, ahem, but as far as changes go, this is like tier 0.5, possibly even tier 0. I'll bump her up for now. While Moze getting his attacks upgraded to AoE is nice, plus no longer needing to worry about ever leaving the departed state, the reduced frequency from 3 charges per follow-up to 8 is really a bummer. Even in Currency Wars with double the teammates and many more attacks to battery him up, the reduction in attack frequency really stinks. Tier 5 change if it was just implemented as is, though I could see it growing up if the attack count was kept consistent. It does make him slightly better in AoE, granted, but that doesn't make up for the massive nerf in single target attack damage and frequency, especially since he can't skill again to add another attack, which was kind of his whole niche anyways between the single target attack damage and frequency. The idea of giving Cipher a fixed damage tally per attack frequency is really interesting, but even if the Currency War numbers were just taken as is and imported straight up, 10,000 bonus damage per attack is laughably low even for follow-up teams. Tier 4, it's Permansor and like half or less of Robin, I guess. Giving Feixiao a follow-up after her follow-up is pretty great. It gets even more insane when you factor in Eagle naturally being her best in slot set due to how many ults she spams, letting her get even more turns and potentially even more doubled up follow-up attacks as a result. Add her E2 into the mix, and all of a sudden you have something almost akin to a perpetual follow-up machine. The reason I use the words potentially and almost though, is because the chance for each follow-up to be doubled is a measly 25% at base, with no chance of proccing it more than once. Like, are we for real right now? Yanqing's follow-up has over twice the odds of proccing, and it's not exactly known for being the paragon of consistency. Heck, it's less accurate than Pokemon's one-hit KO moves, which have a 30% chance of landing, and well, that's the buffed version. That chance used to be 20%, which is where this infographic comes from, pre 3.8. The ramping permanent damage boost per follow-up attack is at least unconditionally good, but overall, this buff would be way too slow and inconsistent if just imported as is. Tier 4 with, I guess, Tier 3 potential, maybe Tier 2 if you get insanely lucky. Ratio's A6 trace providing a slight incentive for more debuffs than the minimum 3 needed to guarantee his follow-ups always stood out to me as untapped potential, so I'm glad to see Huohuo really leading into that playstyle by letting him perform as many as 3 follow-up attacks in a row per skill with enough debuffs. They also raised his initial chance of performing a follow-up, and doubled each additional debuff's chance raise from 20 to 40%, so you aren't exactly penalized for not running any more debuffs than you normally do either. Pretty creative change, especially since the additional 5 energy from each follow-up also helps with his ult rotation. Still though, being chained to debuffers isn't quite ideal, even as strong as they are today, and Ratio still naturally needs to take his turns in order to get more follow-ups, so he gets a tier 2 rating for now. Still very impressive. Similar to Moze, Robin's changes probably work better within the confines of Currency Wars, as a 200 speed ult is just too fast for most characters to properly take advantage of. Just acting twice in Robin's ult takes 200 speed compared to the current Robin, who with their base 90 speed concerto lets characters act 3 times in her ult if hitting an effective 180 speed. It is definitely possible to hit pseudo 200 for one natural turn with a combination of DDD and or Eagle procs, as one proc of each will lower your speed requirement by about 50, but it really does feel like more of a Currency Wars thing. I'm also not exactly sure if they'll implement this as is anyways, due to the high casual barrier, and since Robin automatically ults whenever her own turn occurs, and importing that in would remove her need for energy regen altogether. A questionable decision to say the least, since energy regeneration is such a huge component of her S1. It would also necessitate building high speed on Robin to minimize the downtime between Concerto ending and her next turn, which just feels really weird from a design perspective since she was typically running 120 speed at most before to make the most use out of her ult scaling attack percent buffs. That being said, needing to re-gear a character and having their sig be obsolete has definitely happened with Nova Flare buffs before, see Jing Liu and Kafka and Silverwolf for example, so it's not impossible, although I still highly doubt it. Perhaps this would better incentivize running Feixiao with action advancers like Bronya and RMC, sorry Sunday, no advancing harmonies, but something tells me that a rework like this isn't making it into the base game like exactly as it's shown in Currency Wars. Tier 3 based off of high potential, but with a very heavy asterisk that not many characters would be fast enough to effectively abuse it. Topaz, on the other hand, would love absolutely nothing more to have her Currency Wars kit imported onto her base. Advancing forward per ally follow-up, with the increase being even higher for follow-up attacks, like 8 to 12% is not nothing, it adds up really fast. Making both Nummy and her Proof of Debt debuff AoE and letting the vulnerability apply to all sources of damage? What is this, an actual 5-star character? Jokes aside, this is a massive change for Topaz, since she has no way of advancing her own action until her E4, which also just happens to be one of her best Eidolons too. This also lets her finally catch up in terms of attack frequency to March and Moze, since unlike them, she needs her E2 to generate energy outside of her turn. The AoE damage is also obviously great, and I'm sure some people are already thinking of potential synergies between like her and Himeko in Pure Fiction, given how the duo was popular way earlier in Pure Fiction's meta. Even without thinking of specific combos though, these changes are easily tier 0 and would serve as a very pleasing Nova Flare if they were to implement it. Just gotta pray the shop character gets buffed though. Moving on to the energy batteries, all Tingyun gets is an extra 10 energy per ally turn to offset the fact that she doesn't naturally generate any while off field. That being said, gaining an extra skill's worth of energy every 3 turns, while simple, is really nice for someone who wants to spam ults to donate energy and advance the whole team via DDD as much as possible. Tier 3 change. Nothing too crazy, but it's perfect at letting her do more of exactly what she wants. It might be hard to catch with how much the speed equipments hard carry Aglaea in Currency Wars, but the changes to her base kit are all genuinely nice. Starting with the most noticeable change, Garment Maker now gains 2 to 4 additional speed buffs for their stack limit, letting the duo attack even faster than before. Each stack also provides a damage percent boost for both Aglaea and Garment Maker, and to make the initial ramp up period easier, Aglaea gains 60 energy after her first ult. That's slightly more than one Sunday's ult grants her, and exactly how much Cyrene does. Probably the most interesting change though, is making her enhanced basics also count as ultimate damage. It seems like an admission on Huohuo's part that they haven't done a particularly good job of giving strong basic attack buffs, and it'll definitely come into play with certain ult-based grid Pure Fiction lineups, for example, especially considering how Aglaea's joint attack is considered as hitting 6 targets at once. Not really an impactful buff as much as it's a buff for the sake of inclusion. I doubt anyone's going to be encouraged to run Jiaoqiu with Aggie, for example, to try and benefit from the ult damage bonus. Tier 2 overall though, with an argument for Tier 1, this many positive changes is really nice regardless. Saber gaining more bounces for each ally ultimate is a pretty cool way to improve her multipliers while already strengthening her core gameplay. While her changes do look like a lot of words, it's mostly just raw number increases, so I won't really expand on that. Tier 3, just because adding up 4 bounces to a 10 bounce attack is still a significant increase, even if quite simple. Sunday gaining a weaker AoE energy on ult on top of a single target energy is cool and all, but honestly, is 10% energy to all allies really impactful enough to make him feel stronger all the time? Let me know in the comments. Personally, I'm not sure though. Even with a character like Robin who has a really high 160 max energy, that's still just 16 energy that he's granting her. Less than a basic. I do like the idea of him being able to designate multiple allies as a beatified, though maybe in a fashion similar to Cyrene as a one and done buff that sticks around for the most of the battle. It is a stretch and low-key bordering on fanfiction territory that I'm somewhat imagining based on reading his talent also applying beatified to the first off-field ally, but the idea of being able to change up Sunday's rotations compared to his usual skill, alt rotation is so enticing to me that I'm gonna include it anyways. My video, my rules. Tier 3 if not including this ability to buff multiple allies, Tier 2 otherwise. And this is where we remember that this game has favorites. Because what do you mean each mem advance comes with an immediate mem punch that inflicts 25% defense shred? Keep in mind, there is no duration for this debuff, This is just permanent with no EHR check. That's an E2 Sparkle's worth of defense shred, by the way. The fact that Mem now permanently has Mem supports too, and that their attacks now have the Hunt March property of adding extra RNG hits, which is, by the way, even better for RMC since more hits also means more energy and thus more charge. That's just a cherry on top. For DPS RMC players, this means that you can now keep advancing Sunday or any other support with zero concern, and for others, this makes RMC more of a legit sub DPS. Tier 1 minimum. And here I was thinking they weren't going to make the MC even stronger than they already were. Well, that's nice to have a pretty strong free character. As for our final energy character, Yunli, damage negation per counter hit is super nice. And 3 of it per ult on top of the extra 12 energy per ally action she generates makes Yunli a genuine sustain for her team. Sure, excessive blast and AoE attacks can break through, but for how much of a boost this is for her sustainless clears, I can't in good conscience give this one any lower than tier 1 either. As for the ally side attackers, Mini Herta gets 2 pretty minor but nonetheless meaningful changes. First, for elite heavy matchups, mainly like in MOC, the follow-up she performs versus elite and boss targets are tripled, with her now Kurukuruing at 75% and 25% enemy HP versus the bulkier targets, in addition to the usual 50% HP threshold. To boost her Pure Fiction performance too, she gains a permanent damage boost every time an enemy is defeated, somewhat like a second Sigonia set but without a cap on the number of enemies. Simple, yet effective. Tier 3. On a similar note, Jade just adds a small crit damage buff to her Depth Collector, and no longer has to ramp up her stacks to reap up the maximum damage bonus. All of her follow-ups are essentially treated as ult boosted follow-ups too, mainly to make up for the fact that she has no ult when off field. Even if we disregard the all follow-ups being ult follow-ups, as well as the ramping bonus being instantaneous due to the fact that Jade doesn't really have any way to build those up when off field, just the crit damage buff alone is pretty nice and merits her at least a tier 3 position. As for our Genti changes, woo boy, someone cooked here. It can be hard to appreciate given how low his own rate is and subsequently how bad his trial build feels, but Apotheosis stacks no longer just giving crit rate to himself, but crit rate and attack to all allies is really nice and likely appreciated, especially on a team with RMC and Tribi who fit well with him anyways and appreciate the crit support. Both versions of his ult have also been strengthened, with his 90 energy ult gaining a scaling damage boost with more enemies, just like how Anaxa's skill works, and his 180 energy ult dealing 6 more bounces to the highest HP enemy. While I don't think it's enough to make him quite a top tier DPS, it's a step in the right direction and a tier 2 change at minimum, tier 1 potentially if the numbers are high enough. Realistically, the question should not be why Tribi's Currency Wars buff is so short, but rather why they bothered to even buff her at all. 10% crit damage per ult and follow-up, scaling to 120%, is quite effective on someone like Tribi who saturates more on damage percent. Tier 2. Originally, I thought that needing to choose between buffing himself or buffing the Herta was a pretty neat design choice, but after seeing the insanity that is Evernight and the pitiful damage that Anaxa does on the Herta teams, I really think that he should receive both his self-crit damage buff and the erudition damage buff that he gives the whole team without needing to E6. For someone that's meant to be an Eagle action spammer, it's kinda critical that sub-DPS Anaxa is loaded with as many self-buffs as possible, especially around crit rate, so he can focus purely on speed and crit rate without worrying about sabotaging his main DPS's performance. Since they probably aren't going to give Anaxa crit rate buffs, this is the next best solution. Still a tier 3 change as it mostly affects sub-DPS Anaxa, but I can see an argument for tier 2 as giving DPS Anaxa 50% more damage isn't nothing. And yeah, giving the Madam an extra follow-up after every enhanced skill for more AoE damage and personal energy, as well as for Tribi if she's on the team, is nice. Boosting this number if Mini Herta specifically is on the team is really cute, and also hecka busted in Pure Fiction where the doll is best in slot for her anyways. Tier 2 most likely, since although the extra energy from her follow-up could be especially beneficial in single target scenarios when her energy is lacking, it only reaches its full effect if Mini Herta is alongside her side, which, outside of pure fiction, isn't recommended, and inside of it borders on overkill, at least for the current moment. Buffs in Jing Yuan, name a better duo. Lightning Lord now starts at a base 300 speed instead of the usual 60, gains 50 speed per extra stack instead of the usual 10, and 4 stacks per skill and 6 per ult instead of the usual 2 and 3, and immediately acts at 15 stacks. Well, with lightning wielding, thunder clapping, spirit squashing Lord reaching 1050 speed with max stacks, I don't think that last part is really necessary, even with the pre-buff version where these numbers were lower, but go off, I guess. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, each Lightning Lord action now refunds an SP and advances Jing Yuan by 50%. Yeah, Rappa's Light Cone action advance just in his base kit now. And now he can skill spam with even more impunity, not that he wasn't already coming pretty close with Sunday. Did I mention he's also CC immune now? No more fizzled out follow-ups from this general. The only way he's dozing after this is bulldozing the enemies. With the 50% advance as well, Jing Yuan effectively acts at 200 plus speed every time Lightning Lord goes, so this change also lets the man run attack boots again and still maintain a -1 setup with like anyone, even a 160 speed Sunday who is actually too slow. I'd be crazy to call this loaded of a series of buffs anything lower than tier 0, but would it be crazy to suggest that this wouldn't make him broken in the base game if it was implemented as is? I personally don't think so, given how paltry Lightning Lord's attacks are compared to the great nukes of version 3, but again, comments, I'm counting on y'all to give me a sanity check on this one. Blazing on to our Blood Flame units, Blade really got the short end of the stick of just importing his buffs from Currency Wars over to the base game. Sure, gaining charge for any enemy attack sounds nice on paper, but his 1000% aggro just means that any enemy hits are contributing to his charge anyways. Kind of expected from a character who just got buffed recently, especially a 1-cost character in this game mode, but yeah, it's still a nothing burger. Tier 5 it is. Mighty, on the other hand, received 2 very nice quality of life changes. First, a max HP heal for every God Slayer be God, and a permanent gain in max HP per use. Now, those of you who are more astute might view this as a conditional nerf, as it makes Mighty harder to kill, and thus more susceptible to staying at lower HP and not using his revive. Well, don't fear, because that's where a second change in the form of his new talent comes in. The more max HP he has, the more damage he takes, meaning that he no longer has to worry about min-maxing HP just to plan optimal deaths. You could just stack HP worry-free now. Depending on how high the numbers are, this change could be anywhere from tier 2 to tier 3, since it doesn't really change the core of his gameplay, it just makes the experience a lot smoother. Oh, and also more HP is more damage. That's nice. Jing Liu, unfortunately, follows under the same boat as Bladey, where the only arguable buff she received here was her ability to permanently remain in Spectral Transmigration state, which they renamed as Glacial Soul here. It's not uncommon for Jing Liu to keep her permastate up in a fight anyways, especially with Hyacine, and the inability to trigger her defense shred for overcapping could arguably make this a nerf if just left as is. Tier 5 as well. Evernight changes, while again filled with lots of new text, are fundamentally simple. Besides the multiplier increases, which is a lot of it actually. First, she gives more crit damage the more allied targets are on the team, so even more of a reason to use Memo Sprites to fill up this AoE buff. Second, she gains more Memoria from ally Memo Sprite actions or self HP loss. Keep in mind that she's an off-field unit, any HP loss instance adds Memoria to her, so actually just ignore what I said about HP loss in the previous sentence, which would be a great boost in consistency if added to the game. Unlike Blade, who sticks around and has 1000% aggro, Eevee has a little bit less aggro and is very prone to self-destructing itself. The additional consistency and damage potency, and as well as faster Memoria generation, is quite nice, with the crit damage boost just being the cherry on top. Tier 2. Casters, on the other hand, gets 2 very weird mechanics added to her buff kit. First, she gains more Nuba the less allies are on the field, to the point where you want as little allies on the field as possible to maximize her Nuba charge via her skill. Of course, dropping a teammate just for this is ill-advised since teammates actually, do more stuff than just being static HP bars. Rather, this measure seems to be more to push players to use cast risks at every stage of Currency Wars, giving you a bit of a cushion for having less allies on field. The other interesting mechanic, though, is Netherwing gaining healing per kill it earns, which translates to New Bud. And yes, this New Bud gain applies even if Netherwing blows up for the kill. Giving casters free New Bud as long as she maintains a kill streak can really help her snowball out of control as long as there are enemies to kill, and ironically makes her a bit more like a modern day Seele. Though of course this butterfly is a lot stronger than the last. Tier 3, since the buff is still conditional on scoring kills, but especially in pure fiction where kills come very easy, it's quite the significant upgrade when it goes off. I did not think that Bronya would ever become a part of the HP Drain archetype, but here we are. With this new reimagining of Bronya's kit and the Bloodflame playstyle, she now drains a whopping 50% max HP from herself and the target ally when using her skill. 50% max HP is obviously massive, giving casters in Mai lots of charge to work with, but it's also a heavy cost, especially on someone like herself, who is not built for the HP Drain playstyle at all. Luckily, Maide's high taunt value and casters' extra HP bars via Netherwing and her global passive do a decent enough job at keeping Bloodia alive, and the need for strong sustains, especially in casters' case, overlaps with the massive HP drain that Bronya deals. While it is technically a potential improvement for both Blade and Jing Yuan, Blade might be forced to ult in order to stay alive, losing a stack in the process for gaining one, and Jing Yuan doesn't have as many mechanics to keep her team alive. Speaking of ults though, Bronya's ult also got reworked to last based on 2 of her own turns rather than 2 of the DPS's turns, making it much more consistent and also providing a small max HP buff to her Bloodflame form on top of that. Very nice for everyone. Overall, Tier 2, since while this change doesn't work for every character, the few that it does work for now have a new interesting option that wasn't available to them before, which is really good especially if you're trying to run 2 Remembrance teams for instance. Alternatively, for those that can't handle the HP drain, Bronya still keeps that new ult minus the max HP boost, as well as an alternate powerful damage boost on her skill. Truth be told, I think people underestimate how strong Bronya's buff package is, actually being slightly higher than Sunday's if going by AMP alone. Giving that buff package better uptime, making it closer to Ruan Mei's uptime than Yukong's, would do a lot to help her viability. And of course, in both forms, after a certain number of attacks, the big Cocolia. Tier 2 here as well, support uptime on older supports really does a lot for them. She's just missing SP regen now, which can be worked around, especially with HP drainers. And of course, Tier 0, if we get the big mama attack with her, it's just so much fun. On to the debuffers. While double anti-grav boots Pela is up there with Aglaea in terms of notorious strategies, her actual kit buff involves other allies taking action, not herself. Her off-field energy compensation is plus 8 energy per debuff, which is great for her already absurd energy gain. With enough debuffs on the team, this opens the door to potentially even 1-turn ults, which, if you're not aware, makes it so that 150 speed on Eagle is effectively 200 speed, with obvious Acheron synergy and Easy Pearl's uptime coming with it. That being said, Pela doesn't really need to ult spam more than she does already, so in practice this change will probably feel a bit overkill. Tier 3. Compared to her hunt counterpart, Feixiao, Acheron doesn't really have much in the way of single target. Cue her Currency Wars buff, which adds a stack of what's called Purple Butterfly every time an enemy receives a debuff. Strange name, by the way. Nihility attacks tend to contain a mix of single target via their basics and skills, blast on some select skills, and AoE via their ults, so the end result ends up being that while Acheron gets stronger overall, most of that increased strength goes towards her single target, and decreases as you go out, with blast being a little bit stronger and AoE receiving the least benefit. Especially considering how her maximum ult damage is achieved by removing 3 stacks of Crimson Knot at a time, you don't really want to be spreading her debuffs willy-nilly, and the easiest way to do that is to just focus down a single target the whole time. Tier 2 change, potentially even higher if said Purple Butterfly stacks were counted as part of her ult damage, which, based on her A6 wording needing to specify as such, sadly probably isn't the case. An Acheron main can dream though. Speaking of dreams, Close your eyes. Imagine a character who needs to rely on shields, whose only gimmick rested on a 60% fixed chance, on top of a measly 60% base CC chance, and who relied on their ult for crit rate buffs, but couldn't keep those buffs up consistently. Now, open your eyes, because that character no longer exists in Currency Wars. They really overhauled Yanqing in this new mode. Holy moly! Permanent soulsteel sync, so he now always reliably crits with 0 crit investment and always crits hard, removing his chance-based follow-up and giving his skill a massively buffed 120% base chance to freeze instead, aka he now has the same effect hit rate requirements as Kafka, which is basically 0. Oh, the bonus energy from his follow-up is gone? Well, he has Pella's off-field energy regen too, letting him gain 2 more energy than she does for every debuff instance. And his ult, of course, becomes that massive AoE he unleashes a boss. Do I really need to explain why this change would be tier 0? In case it isn't clocking exactly how good this is, as a hunt unit, Yanqing is faster, and now he can reliably freeze his enemies. Going from one of the most shield-dependent units in the game to a character who can effortlessly go sustainless versus low target scenarios, not to mention how strong his new AoE is, over 1000% multiplier by the way, just shows a glimpse of 1% of the power he gained while growing under Jing Yuan's care. Man, would I kill to have this in the base game. They fixed all his problems and then gave him some more. Oh my goodness. So, speaking of standard 5-star male DPS who got major gloves in Currency Wars, let's run it back. However good you think Welt has it with his Currency Wars changes, think again. Let's start with the obvious. Delaying the action value counter by 20 every time he ults is such a fun concept, and while it likely won't enable any 0 cycles on its own, more time in a turn-based game is always amazing, whether it lets you build towards slower speed breakpoints, or gives you more rotations to output your damage before the wave ends if you don't want to do all that math. That being said, that isn't all Welt gets. Oh no, very far from it. So you know how his ult inflicts 3 stacks of Ineluctable? Well, that's a new debuff, where each stack of Ineluctable also lowers speed and increases damage taken, with double the vulnerability for Welt himself, and can also be inflicted by any ally debuff, not just his own. Plus, each debuff inflicted also happens to add a portion of Welt's attack as additional damage, kinda like the Robin of debuffs. And on top of that, Welt's skill now adds an extra bounce per enemy with Ineluctable. This legit guarantees 1 turn ults with enough enemies, 1 less if you have his E6, and otherwise, well, 8 bounces versus 5 enemies sounds like pretty juicy damage to me. That's a Anaxa boosted Cyrene skill. Or sorry, that's a Cyrene boosted Anaxa skill. What am I saying? But yeah, Anaxa has like, what, 140% damage multipliers? This guy has like 250%. Pretty big difference. Forget about becoming an Acheron support after that. Welt's about to take over as the main DPS. I can already hear X-Naya rejoicing in the distance. Tier 0 without question. Now onto the dot units. Honestly, I'm not sure why Asa's designated as a dot unit here, as her burn is still quite weak, but, you know, having a speed increaser on a dot team is still nice. And the extra 4 bounces that they buffed her with for 24 energy and 20 toughness sure is nice for maintaining her uptime. Tier 3. Sampo, on the other hand, clearly leans more into his dot side, having more bounces on his skill and triggering another Wind DOT proc against units with max wind shear stacks. Note that this does not replace his E4, which already basically detonates wind dots. They stack. Tier 3 as well, only because he's still restricted to wind dots, but hey, until Black Swan's Nova Flare drops, this new Sampo might actually only be 10% behind this time. Kafka, I honestly don't know how to evaluate. She gains stronger skill dot detonation multipliers the more equipment she has, which, sure? Anyways, some way to increase her dot detonation percentages is obviously nice, but reading it just as is, I can't think of any way to properly translate this to the base game. Leave your suggestions in the comments. Tier 5 for now though. since she doesn't have much else, along with a lot of the other Nova Flare units. As basically the second part of DOT strengthening, Hyacine doesn't need too much, so anything extra is always appreciated. That being said, what she did get was a solid upgrade to her ability as a team player. Now whenever she hits an enemy, they become inflicted with the Deep Sea Resonance State, taking an extra proc of weaker dot blast damage from Hyacines, plus one other dot from every subsequent attack. More dot procs is always good, even with how many they already have now, so it's a pretty easy tier 2 at minimum. As for Black Xuan, who is the second to be Nova Flared unit very soon, plus 1 Arcana per ally attack and plus 0.5 energy triggered naturally would both be a welcome addition to Black Xuan's kit, since stacking Arcana and maintaining ult uptime for constant Arcana stacks are both key aspects that she can definitely improve on. I imagine her upcoming Nova Flare will probably do something to address both as well, though maybe not in this exact way. That being said, something I definitely don't expect to be seen implemented in Black Xuan's new kit is her new Destiny Diviner bond, although it would definitely be really cool if they did. Being able to gradually buff your character with a choice between various buffs, maybe perhaps rework to, add a choice at the start of each wave and or boss phase, would be super cool. I just wonder what the cost would be instead of gold though. Max HP? Energy? Maybe the cost is just the opportunity cost of not choosing a different buff option earlier? Regardless, the idea holds a lot of fun gameplay potential, even if it means more UI and button presses. Anyways, playing it safe, Black Xuan's buffs minus Destiny Diviner would probably be like tier 3 if I had to guess, or tier 2 best case scenario if the Arcana stacking and energy regen turns out to be insanely rotation warping. That being said, Black Xuan already tends to get to 50 Arcana anyway, so the impact is questionable. And now, moving on to the final Currency War School bond, skill points. Lingsha is here once again as the usual mechanic abuser she ends up becoming in these SU-like game modes where she gets to gamble infinitely. Gaining temporary SP per turn to fuel her Celestial Jade addiction, and even letting her roll multiple times for multiple additional attacks is really fun, though honestly I'm not sure how often a double or triple success would happen in practice. The SP technology just isn't there yet to hit it consistently in the base game. Tier 3, just because more SP per turn is always nice, even if QQ isn't hitting her upper limit every time. As for Dill, being able to consume as many SP as he wants in a single turn, turning his 4+ SP attacks into AoE, is a pretty cool concept. Granted, since the AoE attack starts later, it is significantly weaker and only really kicks into overdrive with like 6 or more SP consumed. Still though, with enough multiplier buffs, this could be a cool way to make Dill potentially viable in AoE scenarios. Also, the chance to gain extra Squama Sacrosancta after allies consume SP is pretty cool, but only if they raise the fixed chance beyond 10%. Probably tier 4 if implemented as is, since just like QQ, I don't think Dill is struggling to use up all his SP in time, but unlike her, his form of SP gen isn't guaranteed. While almost nobody would reasonably argue that Ceridra is weak in the current meta, she does only work with a couple of characters. Increasing her military merit stack cap, as well as potentially how much military merit stacks each skill she gives, could be incredibly powerful in the right team comps, especially seeing as how now each of her turns gives +1 SP to let her skill span with more liberty. Being able to double basics for skill point characters would also be really cool, opening up the door for like QQ and Dill to actually properly work with her. Though if we want to be a bit more liberal and allow her to duplicate any basic, I'm sure she could work well with Aglaea given her speed boost and Ceridra's buffs being independent of Aggie's own turns. The extra SP might be wasted though. Still, even if Ceridra's meta-defining teams don't really expand all too much as a result of this buff, +1 SP per turn is one heck of a strong buff on its own, and has to bump her up to at least tier 2 on a support. Last but certainly not least within the skill points archetype is Archer. His ult being changed into AoE, even if the splash damage is halved, sure is nice, even if it breaks the Hun tradition of pure single target in base kit. Consuming all skill points with his 5th shot though, I'm not sure how I feel about. In a game mode like Currency Wars it's definitely nice, but In the base game, where the maximum SP cap without like E4 Sparkle is 9 and width is still only 10, I don't really see this being useful. If anything, forcing Archer to end his 5th skill on 0 SP could be detrimental to certain rotations. As fun as he is to play, I think I'd have to bring his changes down to tier 4 if that's all he gets. The AoE ult would certainly be amazing for pure fiction if you're crazy enough to bring him there though. And if you want to include the magician aspect of his kit, maybe throwing around random buffs every 6 or so of his attacks, who knows, maybe he could be like tier 2, tier 1 change. Alrighty, with all the non-exclusive bonds done, let's cover the final 2 units, Feinon and Cyrene. For Feinon, plus 4 core flames at the start of battle is great, letting him ult a whole turn earlier than usual, then opening the door for more unique rotations. How impactful it ends up being might vary depending on the team, since it's basically useless in Cyrene teams, where the condition is charging Cyrene's ult, and less important in Sunday teams for instance. Sunday has no problem giving Feinon his ult by the time the team has finished buffing him, so it's less of a problem of Feinon doesn't get his ult earlier, and more a problem of Feinon gets his ult too early before all the buffs are applied. What I want to dive more into though, and I think is a more interesting but conditional change, is how exactly his Deliverer bond could be worked into endgame. Making him count as nearly every path and element at once maybe, and his attack counts as all types of damage at once, was the closest thing I could think of. While I don't think it would make him necessarily good on teams like the Herta, Acheron, or Dahlia Super Break that have like specific restrictions, it would allow him to take advantage of more endgame buffs, especially since they seem to be fond of naming specific archetypes in them nowadays. Probably a tier 3 change if they implemented it that way, just due to the inherent variability of endgame buffs. Like, one rotation, Feinon might get extra vuln, and another he gains speed, which is mostly useless for him. Wait, what's that? He actually benefits from speed amplification in his game mode? In his ult state? Well, wow, anything like that in the base game would definitely open up some options. Tier 1 isn't out of the window of consideration now, especially considering how he pairs well with Tingyun and E2 Bronya, to name some speed boosting examples. And of course, who else to conclude with but the 3-star auto-win lady herself, Cyrene. I'm not even gonna bother to try translating her poem buffs into endgame, especially seeing as how she has a whopping 38 of them, plus the 5 that appear when attaining her 3-star form. I also don't want to imagine exactly what they mean by stronger buffs to all the Chrysos heirs, as evaluating 14 enhanced buffs also seems out of my wheelhouse, especially since there isn't any documentation I'm aware of that describes the exact strength of these buff enhancements. Instead, let's talk about the fact that Huohuo decided to give this girl 9 recollection stacks at the start of battle, something that all of us had been yearning for in order to fix her slower ult uptime. With a full team of Chrysos heirs, this lets her start at a much more manageable 15 stacks, and with one Chrysos heir missing, that's still 12 stacks, much more doable than the current initial 3 if you ask me. Heck, it doesn't even devalue her E2 either, since obtaining it with a full Chrysos heir team lets her start instantly maxed out at 27 stacks, allowing for some powerful 0 AV shenanigans. Kinda crazy how this singular stack change places her in tier 1 in my opinion, though maybe it's not so absurd once you consider that 9 stacks is 75% of what her E2 offers minus the true damage. Oh well, a man can dream. Honestly though, I'd be surprised if at least one of these changes was actually imported to endgame, though that being said, Firefly's changes were pretty much a blueprint for Dahlia, so who knows, maybe it's possible. With Black Swans and Sparkle's Nova Flares being confirmed as of recording this video, Huohuo definitely has a chance to set a precedent, as these will be our first buff units that can actually be played in Currency Wars. But while we wait for that, what do you think of these rankings? Are there any reworks I missed? Any takes you disagree with? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, have a great day.